Good morning. Today I want to talk about many things that I recall and just going back over a lifetime. I'll just kind of ramble along, no chronological order, anything from between 1915 and 1996. And now today is December 8th, 1996. And next Sunday on the 15th, I'll be 85. I was born December 15th, 1911. Right here in Roger City on Huron Avenue in what is called the John Petalcow House, where Mother and Dad rented at the time that they were married. Now, they were married May 20th, 1908. And Mrs. John Petalcow, Wilhelmina, was an aunt to my dad. She was a stepsister to my grandfather, Herman Grambua, and her Christian Grambua was her stepfather. They came over from Germany at that time. Now, I might say here that at the time that I was born, this would be on Huron Avenue, and the house is still there, that Grandmother Dramberg was here with my mother at that time, and the doctor in attendance was Dr. William Arscott, not Ed, but his dad, William. Now, my dad had been employed by the Presqu'île Bank as of May 15th, 1907. Previous to that, of course, he had taught school in the Metz and Posen area, and he had gone to school beyond the county normal to Mount Pleasant about the turn of the century, 1900, 1901, and then proceeded to teach school in the Metz area and the Posen area. And he decided that he wanted to get into something that was a little more lucrative than teaching school. So he said his dad told him, well, the only thing you can do, he said, you'll have to go and probably get into business or something like that. And he suggested that he go to Ferris Institute, which had an excellent reputation, especially in the area of economics and banking. And so he went to Ferris Institute and took courses there in banking and in bookkeeping and accounting, writing, and things of that type. And it's from that, of course, that he was employed by the Presqu'île Bank. Here started his employment here on May 15th, 1907. He was employed by Charles and Ella Osgood, who had started a bank here, and at that time, and they were the bank people. You remember that later on they had a home, the Osgood House, which is now the manse for the Presbyterian Church, and that's where my dad was working at the time that he was married. Now, the house that we know as our home on 3rd Street was, that lot, for example, where that house is built, was purchased by my folks shortly after they were married, and it was part of what they called Gum's addition to the village of Rogers. That was originally an apple orchard, and that's why, as you recall, on that lot that the folks had there where we built, there were a dozen apple trees and a couple cherry trees. The whole 40 acres had been planted, as much as was available, to an orchard. Pears, plums, and apples of all types and cherry trees of all types in that whole area. Mr. Gum was a local entrepreneur, and he was a businessman, and had several stores here in town, and so those lots were sold. My mother and dad, that would be on North 3rd Street, bought 2 lots. The lot in which the house is built was about 100 by 150. And as I recall from what Mother said, they paid about $25 a lot for the 2 lots, which is a total of $50. And it's on those lots, for example, where they built their home. Now, that was pretty much on the edge of town. There were a few other homes on that lot already, or in that block. The Osgoods had a home there, and across the street, the Bertrams had a home. And down further on the end of the Bertram Street, there was another house built by the name of Skiba, built there. That became the Schlager House afterwards. But nevertheless, that's where they located. Now, my mother said that the plan for the house came out of one of the Detroit papers. They modified it a little bit, but nevertheless, that is the basic plan of the house as you see it there today. Now, the house itself was built by Dad. He contracted it out, not to any one particular contract. He had somebody else first put in the basement area, and most of that was put in by a man named Julius Semple, who was a local mason. And the house was built by a series of carpenters. Some of the carpenters that I recall that she mentioned, one of them was a fellow by the name of Schalk, another one was a fellow by the name of Smith, and there was a fellow named Coolert, another fellow named Yeager. The well, which is a flowing well, was put down by the Pines brothers. And at the time that well was put down, it was about a depth of 150 feet. It hit a flowing well, an artesian well, which was a beauty. And it was capped off, and that well later, of course, was powerful enough so that it could run the toilet system in the house, and which was very, very significant. And I might explain about that. To get back to the well, the flowing wells that it refers to there, in that whole area along that side of the street, there were a number of flowing wells. We had one, the Bertrams next door had one, the Ewells next door had one, Nagels had one, and further over to Erie Street, where the present Radio Shack is, there was a large one, which was also a watering trough for the horses as they came into town. Now the fact that that property had that well on it, with that power, C.H. Osgood, who of course my dad worked for him, asked my dad whether with that well that he thought it would be significant if they put in a toilet system. And asked Dad what are they going to do. Well, he said, we figured we would have a toilet system outside. Well, he said, with that amount of water, he said, you'd be smart, he said, to put in a toilet system right now. And he said, I know that in your plans it showed a place where there was to put a toilet. My dad said, I said yes, but he didn't have the money. And C.H. Osgood said, well, he said, I'll tell you what I'll do. He said, I'll loan you the money. He said, you put in the toilet system. And he said, you pay me back without interest. And at the same time, he said to my dad, he said, what are you going to do about heating that home? And my dad said, well, he said, we're going to use just stoves in the kitchen and also in the living room. Well, he said he thought it was smart. He said, at this time, he said, I understand, he said, you're putting in leads for a furnace. He said, yeah, well, he said, I'll wait for that. C.H. Osgood said, well, I'll tell you what I'll do. He said, I'll loan you the money, the same as the toilet. He said, you buy the furnace, have a fellow named Luft put it in, who was a local tinsmith, and he said, you put it in now. He said, you'll find that it will pay you dividends to get that thing in now. And so that's what my dad did. He got the toilet system put in, and he put in a furnace system in the house, which meant that he put in a area, probably about a 6-foot square piece of concrete on the floor in the basement, which was all sand. and put the furnace on that. And at the same time, of course, he put a block of cement under the chimney that went upstairs. And then later on, as time went on, they finished off the basement floor. But the basement floor, originally, the only piece of concrete down there was the one that held up the furnace and that held up the chimney. Now, there was other piece of concrete that went in the basement at that time, and that was the outside stairway. Because, as you recall, there was about a 4-foot outside stairway that came off the back end of that house. But the various pieces of concrete that were put in the basement floor were put in from time to time. As the folks got a few dollars, they put in a chunk. And that's the way it was until such time that they got enough to do it all. And then they divided off a coal bin, as you remember it, and a fruit cellar. But originally that floor was just sand and gravel. And it was hard, it was firm, but nevertheless that's what it was. Now I might say a little bit something about that basement area. The walls, of course, were built out of stone, various types of stone. Julius Semple built it. But you'll notice that above ground in that area, that the rock that is exposed for a distance probably about, maybe about 2.5 to 3 feet, is split rock. Well, Julius knew how to split rock, and that's why in that area, the part of the basement that is above ground where the windows come in is on split rock. And you'll notice that many homes in that particular area of town were built out of split rock. And but it all depended upon what mason that you had. If you knew how to split rock, well, then you got a split rock. So I just thought that would be significant to mention that. Now, there are other things about that house that I think we probably should mention. Not only did we have a flowing well, but there is a water system that collects rainwater off the roof and puts it into an underground storage area. There was a cistern on the corner of the house facing Yule's, which could hold probably about, maybe about 500 gallons, at least, of soft water. And that's that soft water that Mother used for washing clothes. Now, originally, when Mother washed clothes, before we had the basement floor in there, all the water that was heated to wash the clothes was cooked on the kitchen stove, and she did the kitchen became the laundry on the day that she washed clothes. And then, of course, that was the way you did it. Now, later on, when the basement floor went in, they put in another stove in the basement, and that's where she heated the water to do the laundry. You remember that particular area. Also, I might say, as you remember, that in that basement area next to the laundry was a water-cooled cooler. Water came through from the outside artesian well through a series of pipes that ran through what you would call a refrigerator. And instead of being cooled by ice, it was cooled by cold water. And that's where Mother kept butter, eggs, milk, and things of that type for many, many years, until such time that they got a electric refrigerator. But that's what served as a refrigerator for many years, was a water-cooled refrigerator in the basement. It became as a result of that flowing water well. And as I said today, I said I'm positive that water is still down there if they wanted to tap it. Just like to mention in regard to the toilet system inside. At the time they put the toilet system inside, of course, they had to build a cesspool. And so that the water could drain off into the cesspool. The cesspool was put in probably about 40 feet in back of the house near the alley. And that's still there, still covered, I suppose. I think it's filled up now with dirt and gravel. But at the time that thing started to fill up, some years later in the 20s, Dad had a modern septic tank built. John McDonald, who was the local plumber, lived over there in what they'll call the Coolard House, built a modern septic tank. That thing is still down there, and then years later, years later, of course, The city sewer system came in the probably early 30s or late 20s, and then of course a line was laid to the city sewer system which runs down the alley. Now, let's just say a few more things about the house in general. We mentioned the basement. Now the upstairs, when the house was originally built, there was just one room up there, and that was the so-called back room. That's the room that was later converted somewhat. That's where Grace and Ernestine Treese had their room. Now the back room upstairs, going upstairs, was put in at the time that the house was built, but it was a little different design room than it is there at the present time, which I'll explain. And that's there were beds in there, and it was used as a spare room, and the room was also used by the girls or maids who worked for Mother and Dad. Now at that time it was very common that girls from the country would come into town and work for families. They helped them take care of children. They did housework and a variety of things on a weekly basis. Now I know that some of the girls that you'll recall that we had there, at least I recall, who worked for Mother and Dad, they'd come in on a Sunday evening and stay through Friday evening or Saturday, and then they would go back home. Sometimes they'd work 5 days, sometimes they'd work 6. One of the first ones that I recall was a lady by the name of Emma Raskey. She later on married a fellow by the name of Leonard Polk. And then there was another lady by the name of Arlt, Elsie Arlt. She married Jack Kleiber out in Hawks. And then there was a couple of girls by the name of Schulk. And there was Bertha Zinke, who is still living today, worked for my folks in that capacity. And then another one that some of you people will remember was a girl named Frida Lorke. Now, Frida Lorke was a girl that came from Germany. And she was brought over to this country by a family from Metz called Lipke, Emma Lipke. She was a relative of the Lipkes. And she and other girls came in from Europe. And so Mother and Dad gave her a job, and she came to work with us. Now, it was lucky for her, of course, that my dad and mother could speak German. And, of course, Herman and I, as youngsters, were very fluent in German. And so it was very easy for her to accept that job there because she was in the process then, of course, of learning English herself. And I would say that she learned English very, very fast. And but these were girls that come in. They would help in the cooking. They would help in the sewing. They would help in the ironing and the washing and repairing clothes and doing just general housework of one type or another. They were babysitters, you might say, to give Mother and Dad a chance to have somebody to stay home while they went out, enjoyed themselves a little bit, played Spitzer, or went to dances, or went to the shows, or whatever people would do. Now, getting back to the upstairs in that house, other than the back room, which was right at the top of the stairs, as you all recall that, the rest of that big room was just a great big basketball court up there. It was all empty. All there was in there was a floor. And the windows were in, but I mean, it wasn't divided off. And then, what happened there was that in the early days, of course, when there was just Herman and I there, along with Mother and Dad, Brother and Dad had their regular room, and Herman and I, had that back room. And except when company came, if Grandma and Grandpa Grambua came down, or just one or the other came down, well, then Herman and I went upstairs. Well, where did we go upstairs? Well, we slept in that big room. There were some corn-husk mattresses on the floor up there and some blankets, and we just slept in that great big gymnasium area, you might say. Or if there's a gang of kids would come, or families would come and they had children who came in on the boat or something like that, the kids went upstairs. Boys on one side, girls on the other. They hung a blanket on a rope to separate the kids up there, and that's what they did. Now, there was no toilet up there. Of course, you had to go downstairs to go to the toilet. Now, I might say another about the toilet. In addition to the toilet that we had on the main floor, after the folks put in concrete floor in the basement, they also put in a small toilet in the basement. You recall that. It was just near the furnace. And that made it doubly nice, especially if you had company, because you had two places to go to the bathroom. You could not only go to the regular floor, but you could go to the basement. But that's just in passing. Now, that upper area of the main house, the main room up there, long probably about, I would say 1915 or something like that, was divided up. It was finished off. And that is, we put in the big room upstairs, we put in the middle room, hallways, closets, and at the same time they remodeled the girls' room in the back. If you look at the early photographs of the house that were taken at the time it was built, and there are some, it shows that there was only a single window that projected out of the back of that house facing what you would call a Hammond's or Krotsky's. And when they remodeled, they made that into a nice big room, and I think there are 3 or 4 windows that project out of the back along with closets. And so that room was greatly enlarged at that time, and closets were put in. And because previous to that, there were no closets up there, they just hung their clothes around on the wall, just like they did in many other places. Closets in homes were not known in the early days in those homes. You didn't have that many clothes, so that you just hung them on a rack, which was attached to a wall of the bedroom itself. So when they remodeled the upstairs, they also at that same time electricity came to Roger City along about 1914-15, and so the house was wired. Because when we moved into that house, we were using kerosene lamps, just like everybody else did. But with the coming electricity through the Roger City Power Company, then of course they ran street power poles, and people, as time went on, attached themselves to the electricity that was available. But that upstairs was, I think, probably about 1915 or 16 that it was finished off, and the bedrooms were created upstairs. And I think it was 1915. I'd have to try to look that up. Or maybe it was late 14, I don't know. But I can just barely remember that, just barely remember when we moved upstairs. Now, also, I think it was 1915 about, that the telephone system came into Roger City, and the folks put in a phone. And you remember where that was just in the dining room area, it hung on the wall, a phone. And that was a great thing for that time. When the phones came into or were made available. Now, other people had phones before we did, of course, but nevertheless, that was it. Now, just to add something that I just happened to think about, I mentioned that originally, of course, we had a cesspool, then a septic tank, and now along the city sewer system was put in after World War II. It was put in the years about 1947-48 when the city sewer system was put into operation, and we had the sewage disposal plant put in. I also like to comment that we of course had the flowing well there, and that supplied the water. Now in I think it was 1930, that the city water system was hooked up, and that the city originally the water system was privately owned by the Roger City Water Company. And then in 1930 and 31, they sold it to the city, and subsequent to that, the city water system, when that was put in, it was put in along 3rd Street. The water line comes in off of 3rd Street. And the sewer, of course, goes down the alley. And when that came in, of course, then the folks hooked up. Now, I don't know, somebody asked me some time ago, well, when did they start putting in the sidewalks along 3rd Street? I don't know the exact years, but it was sometime after, it was before, around, before 1920, or in there just before, about the time World War I came along, that they put in the sidewalks. Mother said that because they had a corner lot, there was quite a chunk of dough that they had to put down as their payment. And she says she didn't know. She says she just thought that the cost of putting in the sidewalk was split 50-50 between the city and the property owner. Well, of course, the folks had 150 foot by 100 and 250 foot of sidewalk to put in, one along 3rd Street and the other along Woodward. So it was quite an outlay of money for people at that time to put in the sidewalk system. Now, while we're at it here, I think I might add another little footnote in here, and that is we mentioned about the home and the furnace and the stoves. Now, of course, originally, of course, the home was heated by wood. The furnace downstairs, the basement, that was fired with wood, the chunks of hardwood. And then, of course, the stove that we had in the kitchen, the original stove that we had in the kitchen, was a large cook stove, which was wood-fired. And so as a result of that, of course, you had to split wood. Wood was brought in by the farmers in the round, in the chunk, the beech and oak and maple and everything else, and then that wood had to be split. It had to be dried, and then it was split. And Herman and I spent a lot of time out there as youngsters splitting wood for the kitchen stove. You always had to have a lot of wood ahead, and in case of inclement weather, that was split. But originally, before we got soft coal, before the plant brought in enough extra coal beyond their power needs, so that they could sell soft coal to the community. And then the wood originally, that the fuel that was used originally was wood. That was true, but most places in town that you heated with wood, because wood, of course, was also plentiful. And but that had to be split. And what we often did there, you would try to split enough wood, because wood had to be brought in every day. We had a large wood bin in the back shed as you came in, as you recall, and then there was also a small wood bin which was right alongside of the stove itself. But that always had to provide wood, otherwise if the wood was too wet, you were slow in eating, and slow in cooking. And what we did there is that we had a reserve of wood which was in the basement. We had several cords of split wood which was stacked neatly in the basement, and that was used in case of inclement weather or storms and stuff like that, when it was a hard job to go out and split wood. And so a reserve was always kept in the basement of a couple cords of wood, neatly stacked, that you could use in case of an emergency, in case of very, very inclement weather. But splitting wood was a common thing for kids to do. You got a lot of exercise. And some of that wood was awful tough. And you had to use awls and sledges to break it up. So you got a lot of muscular activity there that was involved in that. And that was a very, very common thing. I just thought I would mention that. Because later on, of course, we got soft coal in, and then hard coal, and then later on they had coke, and then later on again we had clinkers, or a coal which was small. You used a furnace, a conveyor. I can't think the thought of the word. It's stoker. We had stokers, the stoker coal that finally came in. And then, of course, years later, oil started to come in. I know at the time that we built this home here in 1948-49, where I'm in now, we started out with oil. And then, of course, some years later, the gas lines came in, and that's, of course, what we have at the present time. Well, here we go again. Now, been 24 hours since we've been at this, and today is Tuesday, December 10th, 1996. About 3 o'clock in the afternoon. We had a couple inches of snow last night, The temperature is about 30 degrees, and poor sledding. That is poor sledding for the snowmobilers. And so today I thought probably, while I had a little time left on this tape, I would mention a few other things in regard to the house on 3rd Street that we're talking about. I'd like to explain a little bit about the horse barn, or what we call the garage. Yes, that was originally built as a horse barn because at that time, of course, the folks didn't have a car, and neither did a lot of other people. There were a few cars in town, but not too many. So building a horse barn, of course, was very logical. And there were other people, of course, who had horse barns on their property in the immediate area. Bertram's next door had a horse barn, and Captain Valentine across the street had a horse barn. You go there, that building is still standing and is now used as a garage also. And then down the street, in what you would probably remember as the maybe the Shertam House, down at the end of the block, which I refer to sometime as the Fisher House or the Heft House, there was a large barn there. There was also a horse barn on the Emil Nagel property, which is just immediately in back of the Presbyterian Church. And there not only had a horse barn, he had a team of horses. And across the alley, which is now the area around the Rogers City Home Furnishing Department, John McLean had a home there, and they had a team of horses. The horses were very common in those days because some of these fellows, they used their horses to work at the plant. A fellow had a team of horses. He got extra money to take that team down there with a wagon, and the wagons were used to haul materials of all types in the quarry, to haul dynamite, and to work around the yard. Because you got to remember in those days that labor was very, very common. I went back to look, and it said that about, I guess it was probably around 1913 in that area, that there were some 1,300 employees at the plant. Now, you remember that today we got about 135 down there. So labor was very, very intensive, and teams of horses were used in all types of activities down there. And a man had a team, he got paid an extra couple of dollars a day for the team that he used down there in all type of drainances were the concern. Now the horse barn, which we refer to as the garage, sitting right there just where it sits today, was built before the house was built, and I told you before, it was used as a storage for lumber, which came out of the big pine which the folks had inherited, and which was turned into lumber at one of the mills near Hawks, and then that was brought in and stored. Now that barn must have contained an awful lot of material, and of course was fairly good size. But a lot of the structural material that had been cut out of those logs, there were the 2x4s, 2x6s, 2x8s, 2x10s, and for rafters and joists of all types and descriptions, plus a lot of finished lumber. Now this wasn't finished except that it was made into boards that were 1x4, 1x6, 1x8, 1x10, 12, and up to 16 inches. Some of those beautiful boards, 8, 10, 12 feet long, were 16 inches, not a knot in them, made out of that big cork pine tree. And all of those, a lot of that material, of course, was used in the building of the home. Now, the bigger pieces, of course, were used for framing, and for the walls, and for the joists, of course, that were put on top of the rock foundation. And some of those boards, of course, the better boards were used inside for finishing. Not all of it, but some of it. Some of it was sent to a mill in Alpena, and that's where they made those boards, what we call the floorboards, along the edge of the flooring, the beautiful trim that was cut at a special mill in Alpena. But a lot of it was used for shelving, mop boards. That was that item that we talked about, and some of it, of course, was used for the soffit of the house. That's that portion that extends over the edge of the house against the uprights to finish it in. Now, the inside of that house, of course, was lath and plaster, and that was very, of course, common in those days. And the window, a lot of that lumber was used, of course, to trim out the windows, trim out the doors, and but while it did not supply all the lumber for the house naturally, but it did make a quite substantial dent in lumber that they didn't have to buy. Now, the horse barn. In regard, there always have questions about that horse barn. Was that barn ever used for horses? Yes, it was used for horses. Now, you got to remember that these weren't plow horses or big dray horses. These were ponies, or you might mean the smaller horses for carriages. Because people that came to town, or we went out to Metz, you used a light carriage, you used a light sleigh, one-horse sleigh. It was a one-horse sleigh, and they what would happen there is that not every time that they went out in the country, or Dad went fishing, or Dad went hunting with somebody when they used a horse and buggy, did they put in a horse overnight. It's only if they wanted to go very, very early in the morning, because otherwise they could walk down the street, go to the livery stable, and that's where you rented a horse and a buggy, just like you go and rent a Hertz car today, or budget car. You rented a horse and buggy. And so much for the day, or so much for the hour, I don't know just what they charged, but that's what people did. But in certain cases, if my dad wanted to go hunting very, very early in the morning, before the livery stables ordinarily opened, well, they went and got the horse and buggy, or horse and sleigh, whatever it was, and put it up overnight, and then they left as early as they wanted to the next morning. Now, their hay was kept in the loft. You know where the hay loft was? It's just above the second floor in that building, and there were regular cribs there for hay for the horses, and oat bins, and there were sacks of straws. When the horses came in there, they spread some straw on the floor, and the next day, after the horses were in there overnight, they cleaned out the manure, and that was thrown on the garden, and that was dug in the next year for part of the nutrition for the plants or whatever you grew in the garden. Now, the period of time that thing was used for horses, of course, was pretty small, because in 1919, right after the war, Dad got a car. But so you can see it wasn't used too long, but we did use it, and we because the first car Dad got, I think, was 1919, and we would take that car, or you got to remember, of course, that in the early days they didn't plow snow, and even the people who had cars had to put them up in the fall of the year, simply because there's nothing that you could do about it. You had to go to sleighs, and so yes, we did go to Grandma's house in a one-horse open sleigh, and what would happen there is that Dad would probably go and get the horse and get the sleigh for overnight. The next morning we packed up, and Mother and Dad, Herman and I, and away we went to Metz. Got a lot of heavy clothes on, and this is a little bit unique, and that is that in order to keep warm, especially in the wintertime, of course, Mother would heat blocks of hardwood in the oven where she baked the bread. These chunks of hardwood were put in there just like you would put loaves of bread, and was heated, and thoroughly heated, and then it was wrapped in newspaper and then put into a gunny sack, and that was put at your feet in that open sleigh, and by gosh, it kept warm. Some of those blocks of wood were still warm when you got to Metz, and that was about 12 miles away. And when we got to Metz, the horses were put in the barn, and there again, on the way back, in the afternoon, or the early that morning, or whatever it was, they would heat up the oven again, put the blocks of wood in, and came back to Rogers City. There was, as I say, those blocks of wood were wrapped in old newspapers, and then they were stuck into a burlap bag just to retain the heat. But we're plenty warm, and it was nice. But yes, we did go to Grandma's house in a one-horse open sleigh. And then, let me see here. When we got there, we just stayed and for Christmas or for New Year's or whatever the occasion might happen to be. And now at that time yet, of course, this was I would talk about before 1920, and that is that we would go to Grandma's house. And now Carl at that time wasn't married yet. He didn't marry Aunt Gusty until about 1920, somewhere in that area. So there was plenty of room in that little house upstairs there, where they could take in. There were 2 bedrooms downstairs, and there were 2 bedrooms upstairs. One of the big rooms up there could hold about 3 beds if it had to in that little house. That was the same little house that's still standing there today. Now the big house that you remember, where Carl and Gusty lived, that was built after they were married, and but it wasn't there in the early days. And so I just thought I would mention that as we went along. Now, let me see here. Now, speaking about Christmas, I might make one mention in regard to the house. The Christmas tree that we had, of course, was always put into the front room. And it was decorated with whatever items that we had there. And a few glass balls and a few items. Some were strings of various things that Mother made up, cranberries or whatever it was that were dried, and rings of candy and so on and so forth. And then also, we did have some candles. These are regular candles. We didn't have any lighted electric lights. And so some candles were fitted, probably about a dozen to the ordinary tree. These were candles. They had to be put on very, very carefully because they would be lit. And so you had to make sure that they stood free and clear. And now, after that tree was decorated, this would probably be about, maybe 4, 5, 6 days before Christmas, the door was closed. You remember there was a sliding door. Well, that's the thing. And then, of course, what happened there was that's when Mother and Dad would slip the Christmas gifts under the tree. Now, we didn't go in there. Herman and I didn't go in there. You stayed out of there. You probably wondered what was happening in the back of that door, but the door was closed until Christmas Eve. Now, on Christmas Eve, ordinarily, we went to church service at the St. John's Lutheran Church, and then we came back, and that's when the door was opened. Wow, that was really something. And then, shortly after that, Dad would come in, and then very, very carefully, he would light those candles. I think he ordinarily put on about 10 or 12 of those things. They were about 4 or 5 inch candles. I mean, a little holder. And then there was always a bucket of water or two in a 10 or 12 quart pail that was standing right by, because you had to do that in the event of fire. And when a candle burned down about, maybe about a third of the way, you put them out so that you could light them again another time. And those candles, you would hope, would be able to use them for about 3 lightings between then and New Year's Eve. That reminds me also of the fact that at the church at at Christmas Eve, they would have a lighted, candle-lit Christmas tree in the front of that church, probably about 10 or 12 feet high. And that was loaded with candles. And there again, they had to be very, very careful. When church was about ready to start, a group of fellows would get up, including people on stepladders, and they would light those candles. Now, and got to remember this, that at the base of that tree, there were probably a dozen buckets of water. And then men stood by, and they had wads of cotton attached to bamboo poles that they used for fishing. And those bamboo cotton balls were soaked with water. And as the candles kind of burned down, these fellows would reach up with this wad of cotton and snuff it out, because they had to be very, very careful, because you can imagine the consternation if those trees were dry naturally. Well, they were kept as moist as they could be with water, but nevertheless, it would be a very, very dangerous thing. And then just before the service started, then of course they put out all the candles. And then of course for another performance, they had to put in new candles. But yes, we had a lighted Christmas tree in the church. A dangerous, dangerous proposition, but nevertheless, that's the way it happened in those days. Well, then I was going to get back to the house. After the candles were put out, then of course was usually a little song fest. Mother would play